Israel is not just a moral embarrassment to Jews everywhere, it is also a threat to world Jews because it generates anti-Semitism. My research has demonstrated, I've produced evidence that the Mossad, working through Zionist activists in the underground in Baghdad, was responsible for 3 out of the 5 bombs. So the Mossad played a part in uprooting the Jews of Iraq. This Israeli terrorism to uproot Jews from Arab countries is not a one-off event. It's part of a pattern of false flag operations.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. Zionism didn't just dispossess Palestinians. It also erased the centuries-old Jewish communities of the Arab world. For thousands of years, Jews lived across the Middle East as part of the region's cultural and religious mosaic. But with the rise of Zionism and the creation of Israel, that history was violently uprooted with the help of Zionist sabotage. Israel often claims it rescued Arab Jews from anti-Semitism. But what if the threat came from Zionism? What if the Mossad planted bombs in Jewish neighborhoods to scare families into fleeing to a state that saw them as racially inferior? Avi Shlaim, a leading historian and author, an Arab Jew born in Baghdad, has spent years piecing together and exposing this buried history. And his new book, Genocide in Gaza, connects Israel's founding myths with its ongoing atrocities. He's also Emeritus Professor of International Relations at Oxford University, author of several landmark books on Israel and Palestine, and one of the most important voices challenging Zionist mythology from within the Jewish tradition. And he joins me today to discuss all of this and more. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. Avi Shlaim, welcome to Dispatches. It is such an honor to have you on.
Hello, Rania. Thank you for having me on your show.
There's so much I want to talk to you about, and I guess a good place to start is something I think you're most well known for, at least among the crowd of people I spend time with, and that is what you've written about quite extensively with regard to your identity as an Arab Jew from Iraq. And I guess before we kind of get into the specifics, I wanted to just ask you on a personal level, how did that personal experience of being born in Baghdad and then, having spent some time there in your childhood and then ending up in a place like Israel, how did that experience shape your scholarship and your desire to recover the history of Arab Jews that's been quite erased? And I guess maybe we can go from there.
My academic discipline is international relations, and it's about the politics between states, and it doesn't pay much attention to the politics of identity. And it's only when I started writing my memoirs, 3 words, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, that I started thinking about identity. And if you wish, I reinvented myself as an Arab Jew, because most of my life I didn't think of myself as an Arab Jew. And most of my research was on the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I always knew that the Palestinians are the main victim of the Zionist movement. And I co-edited a book with Eugene Rogan on the War for Palestine, rewriting the history of 1948. And I'm known as a new historian, one member of a very small group of people that included Ilan Pappé and Benny Morris. And between us, we challenge all the myths that have come to surround the birth of Israel and the first Arab-Israeli war. I always knew, and I wrote a great deal about the Nakba, about Israeli policy towards the Arab world, and I was very critical of the Zionist rendition of events of this conflict. But when writing my memoirs, I realized that there is another category of victims of Zionism, and that is the Jews of the Arab lands, people like my family who lived in Iraq and had very deep roots in Iraq. The Jews had been in Iraq for 2.5 millennia. So that is what turned my attention to this aspect of Zionism, which has been neglected in the literature. And a major inspiration for my work on Arab Jews is Ella Shochat. She's a leading cultural critic and a professor at New York University. She is of Iraqi origins, Iraqi-Israeli, and she wrote a book called On the Arab Jew, Palestine and Other Displacements. And she has a really excellent critique of Zionism, and she also points to parallels between the displacement of the Palestinians from Palestine and the displacement of our community of Iraqi Jews from Iraq. So that's the link between my academic work and my personal background. And my book is very much an attempt to interweave the personal with the political. And half the book is not about me, it's about the Jewish community in Iraq and the upheaval, the uprooting of this community and ending up in Israel, and the experience for this community. And the second half of the book is my own account, my personal account of my life in Israel and then in London at school. So I think of it as my impersonal autobiography. And my wife read the book chapter by chapter as I was writing it. And when she got to chapter 5, she said, Avi, I'm very worried. I'm on chapter 5 and you weren't born yet.
Spoiler alert. That's hilarious. You know, I wanted to also ask you, before we get into some of the specifics about the history of Arab Jews in the region, I wanted to also give you an opportunity, because you do have a new book that came out recently, just a few months ago. It's called Genocide in Gaza, Israel's Long War on Palestine. And obviously this is more about the current situation, but of course, going back to Israel's founding mythologies and how we got from there to here. And I'm just curious, you know, how does your prior work connect to the thesis in your new book, Genocide in Gaza?
A very, very important link between all my previous work and the latest book on genocide in Gaza. And the link is this. Zionism is a settler colonial movement. The state of Israel is a settler colonial state. The logic of Zionism is the elimination of the natives in order to take over their land and its resources. And with the help of Britain, with the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the Zionist movement embarked on the systematic takeover of Palestine. Today, Israel controls 100% of historic Palestine. And the main mechanism of settler colonialism in this case is the ethnic cleansing of the population. In 1948, there was the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The newly born state of Israel expelled 750,000 Palestinians, more than half the Palestinian population, turned them into refugees, and the name Palestine was wiped off the map. This is the Nakba. During the June 1967 war, Israel captured a lot of more territory from all its neighbors, especially the West Bank from Jordan, and there was another ethnic cleansing. Another 250,000 Palestinians became refugees. And the Nakba isn't a one-off phenomenon or one-off event. It's an ongoing process. Al-Nakba al-Mustamira in Arabic. And in the war in Gaza, this process has reached its climax, its most cruel climax. And in the war in Gaza, Israel has gone beyond ethnic cleansing, although this is one of the aims of the operation, to commit genocide. And in my memoirs, I once wrote that for all its sins, Israel has never been guilty of genocide. And a reader wrote to me and quoted this, and he said to me, "Do you still think that?" So I had to rethink, and I replied and said, "No, I have reconsidered what I have written, and the new reality suggests that Israel most definitely is guilty of genocide." So that's the link, settler colonialism. And I'd like to make one other observation, if I may.
Please.
And that is a quote from Noam Chomsky. And I like to quote that because it's so perceptive. He said, "Settler colonialism is the most extreme and vicious form of imperialism." I'll repeat that. Settler colonialism is the most extreme and vicious form of colonialism. And in Gaza, we can see quite how vicious settler colonialism can be. And the Palestinians, for the last century, the Palestinians have had the misfortune of being at the receiving end of Zionist settler colonialism on the one hand, and Western imperialism on the other hand. First under Britain during the Mandate, and since the end of the Mandate under America. So America is not an innocent bystander. It sustains, it enables and empowers Zionist settler colonialism. And we can see this convergence between the two countries in what is happening in Gaza today.
That's a really, really, really important breakdown of what's taking place. And I really encourage people to check out your latest book. It has, I believe, an opening written by Francesca Albanese, which has been an incredibly important voice throughout this horrific ongoing genocide. I want to go back to the issue of Arab Jews. And I think this is so important for a number of reasons. First of all, I just want to say one of the biggest Zionist talking points that you'll often hear to justify the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, or to try to maybe divert from the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians during the first Nakba, is that just as many Jews across the Arab world were also ethnically cleansed from all of these vicious anti-Semitic Arab countries, and they found safe haven in Israel. And thank God for that. And, you'll often see that talking point coming from some of the most extreme voices. I mean, there's one actually in the UK, you've probably heard of him, Elan Levy. He talks too much, but he's just awful. And he likes to make this point. I think he actually is, part Iraqi himself. But I think it's so important to talk about the real history of this. And then also I come at this from the aspect of, my family's Lebanese. I'm actually talking to you from Lebanon. And I've always found it so horrible how the creation of Israel really changed the dynamics of the region so much. In addition to obviously dispossessing Palestinians, dispossessing Arab Jews, it also completely changed the fabric of this region that always had Jews living in it. So let's go back to before 1948. I'm wondering if you could maybe tell our audience, a little bit about what life was like for Iraqi Jews before 1948, because if you listen to Zionists, they were just living completely horribly. They were subjugated. They were second, third, fourth class citizens because Muslims and Arabs are just so inherently anti-Semitic. And thank goodness for Israel because it came and saved them. So what was life actually like for those people?
So the Zionist master narrative says that there was anti-Semitism in the Arab world and in the Muslim world, and it was endemic, it was pervasive, and it was the main factor that governed the life of Jews in the Arab world. And after the creation of the State of Israel, anti-Semitism was the main factor that pushed Jews to leave their homes and to go to Israel. And this is the theory of the double exodus that you mentioned, that in 1948, the Palestinians, there was one exodus, the Palestinians left Palestine and went elsewhere, and they did so of their own free will or on orders from their leaders. So Israel was innocent. It had nothing to do with creating the Palestinian refugee problem. And on the other hand, and there are 750,000 Palestinian refugees. On the other hand, there were Jews in the Arab world. There were about 850,000 of them, and they were persecuted and pushed out, and Israel very nobly offered them a safe haven. So it rescued them from another Holocaust. That's the Zionist master narrative, and it's complete rubbish because it is a total variance with the fact. The reality is very different. The reality is that there were thriving Jewish communities throughout the Arab world, in Lebanon, where you come from, in neighboring Syria, in Iraq, where I come from, in Egypt, in Libya, and throughout the Maghreb, Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. There were thriving Jewish communities, and in large numbers. In Iraq, during the First World War, the Jews were a third of the population. In 1950, when the Exodus occurred, there were 135,000 Jews in Iraq. Today, there are only 3 Jews left in the whole of Iraq. And the Jewish community in Iraq was the most ancient and the most successful, the most distinguished of all these Jewish communities, and it was best integrated into local society. The Jews played a very constructive part at every level, every aspect of Iraqi society. And for my family, and there were many minorities in Iraq, many different minorities, and a long tradition of coexistence and religious tolerance between the minorities. And the Jews in Iraq did not stand out. They were one minority, like the others. And Europe had a Jewish problem, in inverted commas. The Jews were symbolic of the other, the other. In Iraq, the Jews were not the other. They were an integral part of Iraqi society. For my family and me, Muslim-Jewish coexistence was not an abstract idea or a dream. It was the everyday reality, nothing exceptional about it. And all this is forgotten by the Zionist claim that Arabs and Muslims always hated Jews, and they drove them out of the countries. Now, my autobiography, 3 words, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, there is now an Arabic edition, and it aroused a lot of interest in the Arab world. What is the reason for that? It's because Arabs born after 1948 would have no idea that the face of the Middle East used to be totally different before the rise of Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel. It was a mosaic of different minorities throughout the territories of the former Ottoman Empire, and there was a very good Ottoman legacy of allowing each minority a high degree of autonomy in running its religious and civil affairs. And this Ottoman model of allowing a great degree of autonomy to each minority to run its own affairs suited the region much better than the political settlement imposed on the Middle East by the victors, by Britain and France, after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. So the face of the Middle East was completely different before the rise of the State of Israel, and Israel has been a divisive and a destabilizing force in the region ever since. And we can see today how destabilizing Israel is, not just in the genocidal campaign it's conducting in Gaza, but the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, its attacks on Hezbollah and on Lebanon more broadly. And after the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, Israel immediately invaded the buffer zone and invaded further Syrian territory. So Israel is not a peace-loving, democratic, peace-loving country. It's a very violent and aggressive and expansionist country and a constant source of strife and instability in the Middle East.
Indeed, and it's also acted as an inspiration for those who would love to have similar sect-based states across the region, which I kind of want to talk about it a bit, because I think Israel, or the imposition of Israel as this Jewish state in the region, was, this kind of sectarian model that so many people on the right across the region really want to emulate for whatever identity group they belong to. But I want to ask you, because something that you have done, that you've exposed or uncovered, is evidence of Zionist sabotage in specifically Iraq to help pressure Jews or scare Jews into fleeing. So, this is, again, going back to that Zionist master narrative you're talking about. What you'll hear from the Elan levies is, the Arabs just kept, attacking Jews, and so they had no choice but to go to Israel. But of course, you uncovered something that points to Mossad involvement in specifically setting off bombs in Baghdad. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, because it's a very important aspect of Zionism, of what one person called cruel Zionism, which has always been denied by the establishment in Israel. And since I was a boy in Ramat Gan, near Tel Aviv, I heard rumors that the Mossad was involved in the bombs in Baghdad that precipitated the exodus of Iraqi Jews. And just to start with the facts, in 1950, there were 135,000 Jews in Iraq. By the end of 1952, only about 10,000 left, and roughly 125,000 Jews ended up in Israel. And the Zionist narrative says it's because of persecution of the Jews. And I say, yes, the main reason for the Exodus is persecution of the Jews in Iraq in the aftermath of the 1948 war, in the aftermath of the defeat. But that wasn't the only factor. There was another factor. In 1950 and early 51, 5 bombs exploded in Jewish premises in Baghdad. And my research has demonstrated, I've produced evidence that the Mossad, working through Zionist activists in the underground in Baghdad, was responsible for 3 out of the 5 bombs. So the Mossad played a part in uprooting the Jews of Iraq. Some of my Zionist critics say that I fabricated this, that this never happened, but the evidence is very hard evidence, the kind of evidence that would stand up in court. But my answer to them is that even if I knew for certain that not a single Iraqi Jew left Iraq to go to Israel because of the bombs, I would still condemn Zionism. I would still condemn cruel Zionism, because Israel was created as a haven for Jews fleeing persecution elsewhere. Israel was not created in order to plant bombs in Jewish premises. Moreover, Israel was not created in order to recruit decent local Jewish young Jews in the Arab countries and to turn them into terrorists. But this is what Israel did by recruiting these people. And the other really important point that I want to make is that this Israeli terrorism to uproot Jews from Arab countries is not a one-off event. It's part of a pattern of false flag operations. And the most famous other example is what is known as the Lavon affair. It happened in Egypt, in Cairo in 1954, where there was a ring of local Jews. They were recruited by a Mossad officer whose name was Max Binet. He was the one who, in 1950, was the controller of the Zionist activists who planted the bombs. He was the controller. In 1954, he turned up in Cairo, and he had this ring of Jews, and he got them to plant bombs in cinemas and public places in order to create bad blood between the Nasser regime and the West. They were caught red-handed. The whole ring was rounded up. They were given long sentences in prison. And Max Binet was caught, and he committed suicide in prison. So this is the pattern of Israel behaves behind the scenes in trying to make Jews feel unstable and create bad relations between revolutionary Arab regimes and the West. So this is a very important chapter in my book that throws a lot of light, not just about the story of my family, but about the nature of cruel Zionism.
And of course, this is all to, as you said, make Jews feel unsafe, cause friction between the Jewish community and, as you mentioned, revolutionary Arab regimes, and also to increase the Jewish demographic in the state of Israel, because of course they're dealing with a demographic problem. If you want to be a majority Jewish state in an area that's not majority Jewish, and you don't have enough European Jews to do it, that's why they're looking out to other Jewish communities in the region. And the reason I raise that is because I want you to talk a bit about how Arab Jews were treated when they arrived to Israel, and perhaps how the founding Zionists of the state of Israel viewed the Jews of the Middle East, because, obviously these people were European, and they're coming from a European context. They're participating in a settler colonial project that already views the native Arab population as inferior. So how did that translate into the treatment of Jews from these Arab countries when they arrived, and then perhaps even after they arrived? How were they integrated into the Jewish population of of the state of Israel?
Zionism was a movement by European Jews for European Jews. And the leaders of the Zionist movement looked down on Arab Jews. They had a superior European view of the East as being primitive and barbaric. They had a very low opinion of Arabs. Compared with Europe, they regarded themselves as part of European civilization. And by the same token, they had a not very favorable view of the Jews in the Arab countries. They were a bit better than Muslim Arabs, but they were still Arabs. They still lived in the East. They were part of the barbaric East. So in the early Zionist thinking, the Jews of the Arab lands did not feature very much. The turning point was the Holocaust, because the Holocaust wiped out 6 million Jews. It wiped out the main reservoir for the Jewish state to be, which was the ultimate goal of the Zionist movement. And after the Holocaust, the attitude of the Zionist leader changed. From now on, they were desperate to get Jews from all corners of the earth, everywhere they could find them, Eastern Europe and the Middle East, where there was a large number of Jews. And this attitude continued once the Jews from the neighboring Arab states ended up in Israel. This is fairly soon after the establishment of the State of Israel in the early 1950s. There were a mass immigration to Israel, and the Jews of the Arab lands were not well received. My family was privileged. We were a very wealthy family, and we were spared the experience of the great majority of Iraqi Jews. The great majority, when they arrived in Israel, at the airport, they were sprayed with DDT, with intesticide. And imagine how humiliating this would have been for them, to be treated like animals on arrival in the promised land. And from the airports, they were taken to Ma'abarot, to transition camps, because there wasn't housing to house them. There were no jobs. So they were herded into transit camps, where the conditions were really dire. They lived in tents or in shacks. The sanitary conditions were very, very primitive. No work, no employment, no income, living off charity. The food was Ashkenazi food, European food, which to them was very bland and tasteless.
Yes.
But more seriously, the managers of the Ma'abarot were all European Jews with a rather European outlook, and they looked down on the newcomers. They thought that they were very backward, and they thought they should be grateful for what they were getting instead of complaining about the conditions. So it wasn't a very happy start, and the gulf between Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews, Jews from Arab lands, that was a serious problem in the early years, but it persists to this day. And just to go back to something that I said earlier about the bombs and the Mossad part in uprooting the Iraqi Jewish community, the Iraqi immigrants, the knowledge or the suspicion that Israel played a part in uprooting them fueled their resentment of their new country. So it wasn't a very happy start for relations between European Jews and Arab Jews.
And then moving on from there, you obviously have these people who are like your parents, right? They're adults. They're leaving as adults. So they have memories of where they grew up. They speak a different language. They speak Arabic. They eat different food. They are culturally Arabs. But then you have another generation, their children, who the state of Israel is basically erasing their history and then projecting onto them a European Jewish history, but then they develop this kind of rebranded identity as Mizrahi Jews. So they don't see themselves as Arab Jews. And so I'm just curious, going on from the initial, arrival to decades later, how their position in Israeli society evolved, because what we see today, and a lot of the Israeli Jewish population has some Arab descent in them. I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it might actually be a majority of Israeli Jews.
Yes.
And oftentimes the stereotype is that people who have, Arab or of Arab descent in some way typically are more right wing and more racist. And I don't know how true that is, but I do know that when I see these videos of, for example, on Jerusalem Day, of these younger kids, these younger Israeli Jews, chanting death to Arabs in the streets, I see the images of them, and a lot of them look like they could be Lebanese. A lot of them look like the kids on the street in Beirut. So obviously, there is a lot of Arab in these people, even if they reject it. But I'm curious if you can kind of speak to the evolution of their place in society and how it became that you have this stereotype, maybe a little bit true, that a lot of people of Arab descent who are Israeli Jewish happen to be more right-wing and anti-Arab.
So there was a systematic attempt to erase the Arab identity of the Jews who came from the East, a systematic attempt to erase everything that was Arab, the folklore, the language, the traditions, and to turn them into new Israelis and Zionists. And I remember as a boy how ashamed I was to be an Iraqi in a Western society. And when the opening episode in my memoirs is that I'm about 10 years old. I'm playing in the street with my friends. We are in shorts and sandals, and my father comes along, and he looks very alien. He wears a three-piece suit and a white shirt and a tie, and he speaks to me in Arabic. And I was acutely embarrassed, and I wanted to say to him, Dad, it's okay to speak Arabic at home, but in front of my friends, I would rather you spoke to me in Hebrew. But he couldn't speak Hebrew, so he was completely out of place. But all Jews from everywhere, not just from the Arab world, were subjected to a systematic indoctrination in the values of the new society and the new state. The education system was geared to building a Zionist identity, pioneering identity of all the people. Israel was meant to be a melting pot of people from different cultures, different countries. But a really important aspect of this process is the teaching of history. At school, I only learned about the history of the Jews in Europe. I wasn't taught anything about the history of the Jews in the Middle East. And the American Jewish historian Salo Baron coined the phrase, the lachrymose version of Jewish history, which is Jewish history as a never-ending chain of persecution, hatred, aggression, hostility, animosity, culminating in the Holocaust. And it's debatable whether this is an accurate picture of the history of the Jews in Europe, but most definitely it's not a true account of the history of the Jews in the Arab lands. And in my book, I asserted my right as a Mizrahi Jew to write our own history as I understood it, which had some episodes of anti-Semitism, of one famous pogrom, the Farhud. There were lights, but there were lights as well as shadows. It was a more complex history and a much happier history than that of the Jews in Europe. Now, you pointed to a very important fact, which is that Mizrahi Jews are more than a majority, and they vote predominantly for the Likud and for the parties even further to the right. Now, the official explanation for this is that Mizrahi Jews or their parents lived in Arab countries. They know what Arabs are like. They understand the Arab mentality. They know that Arabs only respect the language of force. And my explanation as to why Mizrahi Jews vote predominantly for nationalist rights and right-wing parties is that they were indoctrinated in Israel to hate Arabs. And also because they're a marginal group, or not so marginal, but in the class system, they're towards the bottom of the pyramid, they're not at the top. And because they're marginal in this sense, they overcompensate by being more Israeli than other Israelis, more Arab-hating, more right-wing, more nationalistic. So I experienced this process when I was in the army in the mid-1960s. The army was a melting pot. We were all Israelis. We were all equal. We were all dedicated to defend our country. But so that was the climax of the indoctrination process that I went, and which every Israeli, whatever their background, undergoes to this day, both at school and in the army. And Israel is a mosaic, is a lot of different subcultures, and the cleavages between European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, and Mizrahi Jews, between religious and secular, between Israelis and the Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel. But the conflict was used by the Zionist leaders in order to unite the country behind the regime, and the external threat was always exaggerated, and no Israeli leader has manipulated the external threat more than Benjamin Netanyahu, who has nothing positive to offer. He's totally negative, and he calls Hamas which is a negligible military power, he says it's an existential threat to the state of Israel. So we mustn't forget the manipulation by Zionist leaders of the conflict with the Arabs.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely really good at everyone's the next Hitler, everyone's the new Nazis behind, around every corner. As you were talking, I was thinking to myself about the way that, there's also another minority group that the Israelis have that the Zionists have recruited in a bizarre way, and that's the Israeli Druze, which is something that kind of fascinates and disturbs all of us, surrounding Israel. I actually come from a Lebanese Druze family, and interestingly enough, the Israelis occupied Lebanon in 1982, they occupied up to my family's village, and a lot of the people that were on the Israeli side were actually Druze, and they were speaking Arabic. And my grandmother always tells this story about how she was, yelling at this one Israeli soldier, "Shame on you, you traitor," because he was he spoke in the sort of Druze, what we know as the Druze accent. But I'm just curious, when it comes to this Arab Jewish identity that, obviously identifies as Mizrahi, as you say, but has a lot of cultural things in common, you would think, with, for example, Palestinians. Was there ever a time when that caused any sort of alliances? And I'm just curious, in the Israeli, the Druze context, I guess they don't call themselves Palestinian, but I mean, technically they would be. Was there any, cultural alliance at any point between them, or did they see each other as just completely separate and not really interact?
Israel once had a theory about the alliance of the minorities. And the premise was that the Middle East consisted of many minorities. The surrounding Arab world wasn't homogeneous, Sunni Muslims, but there are many minorities. And Israel's strategy should be to form alliances with the minorities. So an alliance with the Maronites in Lebanon, an alliance with the Kurds in Iraq, which was a very serious relationship with Israel supporting the Kurds in Iraq. And the Druze were part of that setup, but they were a very special case. In the 1948 war, there were Druze on both sides of the hill. There was a Druze battalion in the Syrian army which defected and joined the IDF. And after the borders were drawn, in 1949, there was a large Arab minority in Israel, 150,000, and that included a significant Druze minority. But Israel always pursued a policy of divide and rule between the Arabs, between the Muslims and the Druze. One striking illustration of that is that Arabs are exempt from national service, but Druze are not exempt. So Druze serve in the army, and Druze serve in the border police as well, which has a reputation for brutality. They speak Arabic, but they have a reputation for brutality. But the truth of the matter is that Israelis regard all Arabs and as not having equal rights. And the proof of that is that in July 2018, the Knesset passed the Jewish nation-state law, which said Jews have a unique right to self-determination in the land of Israel. So it created two categories of citizens, Jews with superior rights and Arabs with inferior, including Druze as inferior rights. And there was a Druze uproar. The leaders said, but we are loyal citizens of the state of Israel. We do everything. We pay taxes, we are loyal to the state, and we serve in the army. and now you are treating us as second-class citizens. So it shows you that this policy of divide and rule is pervasive on the part of Israel since its birth, and it also is applied inside the state of Israel rather than in the region as a whole.
I want to also ask you about the left. And it doesn't really seem like there's any left in Israel now, but you consider yourself, I've heard you say it, you're like a leftist. And I'm wondering if you could maybe just kind of briefly tell us, about if there ever was a viable left in Israel. It seems like Zionism really made that very, very difficult. And also, what do you make of today's leadership in Israel? You have people like Benjamin Netanyahu, which kind of seems to sit more at the center of politics, because the country, and this is obviously just me watching from the outside, but it really seems like the country of Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich and people like that at this point, who really seem to be driving policy, and they have a very messianic vision that, I'm not trying to downplay the horrors committed by the original, Zionists, but there definitely does seem to be a difference in how they view the world.
The left, or rather the Labour Party, which ruled Israel, was the dominant party for the first 3 decades of statehood, is a spent force. Today, there are 6 members of the Labour Party in the Knesset. There are many reasons for the decline of the Labour Party, but one specific factor, is the collapse of the Camp David summit in July of 2000. The principals were Bill Clinton, Yasser Arafat, and Ehud Barak. And it was Israeli intransigence which was the main reason for the collapse of the summit. But and that was the moment of truth, when there was an all-out attempt to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem, and because of Israeli intransigence, because Israel's terms were not good enough, the summit collapsed. And then Barak went home and he said that there is no Palestinian partner for peace. No Palestinian partner for peace. If there is no Palestinian partner for peace, then why vote for a party, Labour, which advocates negotiations? If there is no Palestinian partner for peace, you need someone, a strong leader, who is good at killing Arabs, at fighting Arabs and killing Arabs. And Ariel Sharon fit the bill, and he won the election of 2001, and the right has been in power ever since. And since 2000, since the Second Intifada, Israeli society has been moving steadily to the right. And look at the composition of the present government led by Benjamin Netanyahu. It's the most far-right, xenophobic, expansionist, overtly racist, and Jewish supremacist government in Israel's history. And the policy guidelines of this government say Jews have an exclusive right to self-determination, not only in Israel, but in the whole land of Israel, which encompasses Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank. So this is an extremist government with an extreme right-wing Jewish supremacist agenda. And Itamar Ben Gvir is the leader of Jewish power, and Bezalel Smotrich is the leader of religious Zionism. So these parties are not just Zionist parties, they are religious Zionist parties, and the government denies that Palestinians have any rights anywhere in the state of Israel, that's anywhere in the West Bank or in Gaza. The ultimate objective of this government is the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and the West Bank, and the formal annexation of the West Bank. So it's the extreme right which sets the tone in this government and dictates its policy. And for this reason, this government is incapable of making peace with the Palestinians. There was a ceasefire. Israel violated it. Every ceasefire agreement was violated not by Hamas since 2008, was violated not by Hamas, but by Israel when it no longer suited it. And the last ceasefire agreement had 3 phases. And when the first phase ended, the government refused to continue and to withdraw from Gaza because Smotrich and Ben Gvir would have brought down the government. So this government is incapable of making peace or even agreeing to a ceasefire. It's a government that can only wage war. And Netanyahu is a proponent of not of peace, not of compromise, but of permanent conflict. And also, he needs to continue this war for personal survival, because at home, he stands accused, he stands on trial for very serious corruption charges. And if convicted, he'll probably end up in prison. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for him. So Israel is now headed by a war criminal. And if his government collapses, because it agrees to a ceasefire, he will no longer be prime minister, and he would have to face trial. So he has a personal stake in continuing this war in Gaza for personal survival. And you don't have to accept my word for it. Recently, there was an article by Ehud Barak in the Financial Times.
Olmert, I think it was Ehud Olmert, right? Was it?
There were 2.
Oh, there was 2. Oh, they both came out.
Ehud Barak was in the Financial Times, and Ehud Olmert with an equally powerful critique of Netanyahu in The Observer last Sunday. And Netanyahu and Ehud Barak says that the war in Gaza is a strategic disaster for Israel. Strategic disaster. It's not achieving anything, and it is only being continued to serve the personal survival of Netanyahu. But this is a very serious comment and condemnation of this war, because Israel's aim, declared aim, is the eradication of Hamas. This is totally impossible, and Israel has had 19 months of non-stop bombardment and destruction and carnage, and it hasn't eradicated Hamas, because Hamas cannot be eradicated. So the obvious question is, why is Israel continuing this war? And the answer is, Israel's leaders, the ones who count, Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, and Smotrich, have an extreme right-wing Jewish supremacist agenda. They're racist, and they want to purify the land of Israel. Not just get rid of all the Arabs, but purify it and have a homogeneous Jewish state. That's the agenda of this government.
So from that, I want to ask you, can Israel as a Zionist state, as this Jewish supremacist state, can it survive? And I ask you that also in the sense of, I very much don't want that version to survive, because the level of destruction being wrought is just so horrific. I mean, all of us, you, me, everyone who's watching this is just horrified. And, every day you don't think it can get worse, and it gets worse, and it spreads. In terms of like the geographic amount of areas being destroyed by Israel are spreading, they're bombing Syria, they're bombing Lebanon, they're destroying the West Bank, and just Gaza is just, there's not really words to describe how bad that is. And of course, there's also internal tensions inside Israel as well. But yeah, I mean, do you, as a historian watching this play out, can this ideology survive?
I think not. But the process of decline and disintegration would be a long drawn out. And what we're witnessing today is a spasm of violence, which is typical of empires towards the end, when the empire ceases to act rationally. Now, Zionism cannot survive in its present form because it's an apartheid state, and in the long term, apartheid is not sustainable in 21st century. But for the moment, Israel is supported by America. It's condemned by nearly everyone else. Even Israel's best allies, closest allies, Britain, Canada, France, issued a statement last week condemning Israel, what it is doing in Gaza. So Israel is alienating everybody, including its closest allies. Israel has been denounced by the International Criminal Court, which issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and his former defense minister. That's hugely significant. It means Netanyahu heads a criminal state, a criminal gang, which is committing war crimes. The International Court of Justice has issued a comprehensive ruling about the legal status of the occupation, and everything, the occupation has been illegal, unlawful from day one, and everything that Israel has done ever since, all the settlements, the annexation of East Jerusalem, the so-called security wall on the West Bank, everything is illegal and is denounced by the International Court of Justice. But Israel has a friend, the United States of America. The United States of America has a veto power on the Security Council, and America has used the veto power time and again to defeat resolutions that are not to Israel's liking, including 3 ceasefire resolutions during the war in Gaza. And Israel doesn't care about the entire world or about the UN. It's waging war on the UN and on UNRWA as long as it has America's support. And it has got America's support, so it can continue going. So I blame America. America is not just complicit in Israel's war crime. America is the enabler of these war crimes. And in the longer term, Israel cannot survive in its present form, and I don't know what is going to happen. What I do know is that the two-state solution is dead.
Oh, yeah.
And it's become fashionable to say that the two-state solution is dead because of the Israeli settlements and Israeli land grabbing, which continues even as we speak. And but I would go further as a historian and say the two-state solution was never born, because no Israeli government since June 1967 has offered the Palestinians a two-state formula which would be acceptable to the most moderate of Palestinian leaders. And secondly, no American government has really pushed Israel into a settlement. And this is not, it's true of Biden, Genocide Joe, and it's true of Trump as well. They haven't pushed Israel into resolving the conflict. So the two-state solution is just a form of words that politicians use because it's convenient for them, but it's kalam fadi, it's empty talk. And I used to support the two-state solution when I thought it was viable, but now I've changed my mind. I feel that Israel has killed the two-state solution, and the only choice is between the status quo, apartheid, and a binational state. So I support a binational state, one state with equal rights for everyone who lives in the space between the river and the sea. And equality is crucial. Equality is a crucial ingredient of democracy. You can't have democracy if you have different categories of people. So when I say from the river to the sea, what I mean is that everyone who lives in this space should have equal rights, regardless of religion and ethnicity.
It should be an uncontroversial idea, but of course, there's certain countries that have tried to like outlaw that phrase "from the river to the sea," and I raise that because I want to ask you about an article that you. That will be published by the time this video comes out. It will have been published in Middle East Eye, and it's about Hamas, and that you are advocating or you're arguing that the UK should adopt a more nuanced stance on Hamas, and that it should not be prescribed as a terrorist organization. And so I want to give you the opportunity to tell our audience, why do you feel it's necessary to challenge that sort of blanket terrorist designation? And what does it tell us about the influence of groups who advocate for that sort of prescription, like, the Conservative Friends of Israel, about their influence on UK foreign policy?
So in Britain, Hamas, the military wing of Hamas was proscribed in 2001. And 20 years later, in 2021, Priti Patel, who is very close to the Israel lobby, very, very close to the Israel lobby, as Home Secretary, passed a law which proscribed Hamas in its entirety. Before that, the conservative governments used to make a clear distinction between the military wing, which is a terrorist organization, and the political organization, the political party, which was not proscribed. And I think the mistake was to proscribe the whole of Hamas, and to end this distinction, because it's a very important distinction. And I support the deproscribing of Hamas because I'm a historian of the conflict, and I know, or I feel, that in the West, only the Israeli narrative about Hamas is known, that it's a terrorist organization, therefore it should be proscribed, and everything follows from this distorting terrorist narrative. And you need to look at the history of Hamas. In January 2006, Hamas won a fair and free election and proceeded to form a government. Israel refused to recognize the government and resorted to various measures to undermine it. Then in 2007, Hamas formed a national unity government with Fatah. It was a moderate government. Once again, it offered Israel negotiations on a long-term ceasefire, and Israel refused to talk and continued the fight against Hamas as a terrorist organization. Hamas also moderated its program. It used to call for a unitary Palestinian Muslim state from the river to the sea. But after it came to power, it moderated its program, and it would accept a two-state solution. It would accept a Palestinian state on the 67 lines. And all this history, taking the parliamentary road to power and the moderation are completely ignored because of the terrorist label. So everything Hamas does is terrorist. Now, the military wing does commit terrorist acts. 7th of October was an abominable terrorist act in as much as it was an attack on innocent civilians. But much of Israel's operations, successive military assaults on Gaza, by my count, this is the 8th military assault on Gaza since Mossad-led in 2008. Inasmuch as these military offensives are directed not just at Hamas, but at the Palestinian society as a whole, they are acts of state terrorism. So we shouldn't bandy about the term terrorism just in relation to Hamas. We should look at its history. We should look at its attempts to find a compromise. And we should stop supporting Israel in its refusal to put Hamas moderation to the test. So we need to review the relations between Israel and Hamas, and the conclusion that I've reached is that Israel is the problem, Israel is the aggressor, Israel is the occupier, and we should enable Hamas. We should deproscribe Hamas because it is a political movement.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing happened with Hezbollah, right? They prescribed the political wing of Hezbollah. And of course, doing this makes it impossible to basically have any sort of negotiations, because if everyone's just a terrorist, even the political diplomatic wing of these movements that happen to also have armed wings, then you can't talk to them because you're not allowed to talk to terrorists. And then it's, of course, used in this extended way where then anybody who says anything that's even remotely nuanced about these organizations is then deemed to be supporting a prescribed terrorist organization, which is, of course, how they have in the UK, specifically how the counter-terrorist police have justified actions against journalists, like confiscating their devices and raiding their homes. And in the US, we still have the First Amendment, but, you know, that's under attack as well. And interestingly enough, in a lot of these Western countries, these sort of civil liberties that we have are being attacked in defense of Israel because public opinion is so against Israel. So, as long as this continues, the ricochet effect is just horrific. And then you have the shooting that took place against these Israeli embassy staffers. I guess now it was, a week ago? It feels like it was so long ago because every 2 days something insane happens that makes you forget what happened the week before. But all that's to say, the last thing I want to end here on Avi is, Israel's behavior, you've often argued it generates anti-Semitism. And it's meant to. I mean, Netanyahu seems perfectly happy about that because the more Jews feel unsafe around the world, the more you can promote Israel as being the place they should come live so you can increase the Jewish demographic. But all that's to say, for the last 19 months, these atrocities in Gaza have been carried out in the name of the Jewish state, in the name of defending the Jewish state. And it's, only logical that what you're going to see come out of that, if Israel keeps saying, we are the Jewish state, we're doing this for Jews, this is for all Jews, we represent all Jews, there are people who are going to believe that. So I'm just curious how you feel about what this is doing to a 2,000-year-old religion that's being used as a shield for a U.S.-funded settler colonial project to control the Middle East.
Israel claims to speak on behalf of all Jews, but it has no mandate to speak. It only has a mandate to speak on behalf of Israelis. And in the war in Gaza, Israel has violated not just every international humanitarian law, but it's also violated core Jewish values. The core Jewish values are altruism, truth, justice, and peace. And these are universal values. They are not sectarian values. the government of Benjamin Netanyahu is the antithesis of these core Jewish values. The essence of Zionism, the essence of Judaism is non-violence, and this is the most horrendously and relentlessly violent government in Israel's history. No wonder that so many Jewish groups around the world are up in arms against this government. Jews for Peace in America. In this country, there is Jewish, I'm a member of Jewish Voice for Labor, Jews for Justice for Palestinians, Free Speech on Israel, and more and more Jews around the world are making their voice heard and saying, not in our name. And there are demonstrations by Jews against what Israel is doing, against the genocide, because ethnic cleansing is not Jewish. Genocide is not Jewish. And it's so appalling that the Holocaust, which was that Israel, the national identity of Israel is inextricably tied to the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. But in the Holocaust, the Jews were the defenseless victims of Nazi Germany. And today, it's the Palestinians who are the defenseless victims of a violent Israeli state. So Israel is not just a moral embarrassment to Jews everywhere, it is also a threat to world Jews because it generates anti-Semitism. In this country, since the outbreak of the war in Gaza, there's been a 400% increase in anti-Semitic episodes. Why? It's not because of anything that the Palestinians have done, it's because of the Israeli genocidal campaign. But as you pointed out, Netanyahu isn't bothered by that. He's very happy for anti-Semitism to drive Jews to leave their countries and to go to the state of Israel. And there's always been a curious relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism. Theodor Herzl, the visionary of the Jewish state, wrote in his diary once, "The anti-Semites will become our strongest allies." Why? Because anti-Semites don't like Jews, therefore they like there to be a Jewish state where all Jews should go there. And it's not an accident that Netanyahu's friends are anti-Semites, like Viktor Orban in Hungary. So today, Israel is a real threat to the Jews everywhere because it's completely distorted the message of Judaism in pursuit of state power and state interests.
Well, Avi, I want to thank you for joining me and breaking all of this down. I really, really can't express to you how much I appreciate all of your work, and so many people do. I'm so happy to hear that your book is being read across the Arab world now. That's incredibly important as well. Thank you so much. I hope we can have you back on again in the future, and hopefully better things will be happening in the world that are happening now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.